Hello and welcome to this edition of Introduction to Psychology, looking at Chapter 8, the process of memory. Now, as common as memory is as a concept, and certainly a unifying aspect of our identity and personality, we're still at a loss as to how it really happens. We have lots of theories about pathways developed in the brain and extra attachments between neurons that actually represent the physical manifestation of memory, but we're still trying to get our heads wrapped around the whole thing. So even as we talk about it authoritatively, we're going to use the information processing model to talk about memory as a structured process and how we think it operates, and then looking at some learning tips that we can get from understanding how memory works. We're still at a loss as to how it actually works. Now, I want to introduce, however, popular media has a lot to say about memories. When we think about movies and whatnot that have come out, and people recollecting memories, people having suppressed memories, and all this, memories are a huge part of what exists in the media. Now, one movie that did come out that kind of directly addresses the idea of memories is, of course, the Disney Pixar movie Inside Out. One of my favorite movies in the whole Pixar world. Now, what this movie portrays is that these 5 primary emotions are symbolized in our brain and help the character in the movie to make decisions, and the interactions between these emotions is the plot of the movie. Now, one of the other aspects of the movie was the idea of core memories, and that has actually sort of caught on in the popular culture. The idea that we have core memories that exist, maybe a limited number of them, sometimes maybe only 5 of them, that shape who we are. And our ability to hold on to those, and sort of addressed in that movie, is, we don't want to lose our core memories because then we lose ourselves. Now, core memories actually do exist, but not quite the way they're perceived of as sort of like these 5 absolute memories that we saw being portrayed in that movie. Core memories, for one, we don't only have 5 of them, we have many core memories that have to do with our identity. Core memories don't drive our personality, absolutely. Memories function to help us define ourselves, to engage appropriately with other people by storytelling and recognition, but also a directive function in terms of how we learn. So learning, as we've already discussed, has to do with memory. I mean, I'm not going to remember something is good or reinforcing unless I have the ability to remember that, remember associations and whatnot. So memory is a very important part of us learning things in our environment so that we can survive and thrive. In addition, childhood memories themselves, although very important, are not always the strongest ones. Events later in life can become very important as well. We can't predict exactly what will become a core memory and what will not. We might think that early childhood experiences like trauma and abuse and whatnot, although we might think that those do become core memories, or going through a divorce or something like that as a child would be then almost guaranteed to be part of those core memories, but they may not be. The individual may not refer to those as absolute aspects of who they are as a person. And as we will find out, the actual process of creating memories is constructivist, and therefore the accuracy of core memories is not any more greater than any other memory. And I'm implying here some of what we're going to be talking about, and that is the fact that our memories are often faulty. Now, how do we use memories? The function of memories across the brain, different aspects of our daily lives as mapped across the brain rely on memories in order for them to act. So first we have the hippocampus here. The hippocampus processes information spatially, the declarative memory is there, and consolidation of information into memories is all happening in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is an incredibly important part of the creation of our memories. Now, the amygdala emotional part, which we might see activated in a fight or flight situation, I'm going to add a couple more here: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. This is a sort of expanded fight or flight discussion here. Those things, the ideas that we have when we assess a situation emotionally, and we're looking for an emotional reaction to that, we're relying on memories to tell us about the nuances of that particular situation so that we can make a good decision. Do we try to get away? Do we fight? Do we freeze? Or do we fawn? Now, you might not have heard of the freeze and fawn before. You sort of hear of the flight or fight. Freeze is you just stay still, you're out of the situation, you fade into the background, that kind of thing. And fawn is when you try to get on the good side of somebody. And thinking about certain kinds of interactions, like say a person is threatening you, you could respond in any one of these ways, but also in other emotional situations where you're in an interview or someone cuts you off or something like that. How do you respond to those situations? Those automatic processes are being fed by memory associated with the different circumstances under which we might experience the necessity to go into one of these states of mind. Now, and then finally, we have up here in the prefrontal cortex, we have the process of decision making, the actions that we take, and evaluation as to the effectiveness of those actions. You can see it's almost like all the workings of the brain, all the functions of the brain that we've been talking about, and sensory information and all that stuff, is all about the management of memories. And so memory is sort of like the stuff of the brain. Memories encompass the definitions of concepts that we have, of our past, of our identity, all of those things. That's the working material that we have in the brain. So just to drive home how important memories are, and considering that in light of when somebody loses memory, or because of a disease process, or they lose memory because of a head injury or a disease or something like that, how devastating that is. There's probably, in my experience, there have been very few circumstances worse than the experience of having a loved one go through the process of Alzheimer's or dementia, and the loss of their identity, the loss of their ability to recognize their own loved ones and whatnot, and how horrible that can be, because so much of who we are depends on that process of being able to process our memories. Now, the approach to understanding memories that we take in at this level of understanding here in Introduction to Psych is based on the information processing model. Now, the information processing model is a perspective within psychology that uses terminology and understandings of how computers work, mechanistic ways of understanding things that we think are happening, but there's actually really no biological sort of evidence that these things are going on. So it's a model that predicts the processes that happen in memory, but there's not necessarily a brain-based correlate to that. I mean, when we're learning, the whole brain lights up. Lots of things going on. But we can describe the process of memory, and we can talk about strategies for learning and interference and recollection and all that stuff using this particular model. So let's take a look at that actual model here. We have this sort of graphic presented here. And what I'm going to do is we're going to take information, represented by this red dot, and we're going to go through and talk about each aspect of the memory process. So when we talked about sensation and perception, we talked about the sensory organs actually being the first limiting factor, that what our eyes, ears, skin, and all those other senses can take in as information, the actual perceptual limits is the first dumbing down of information, let's say, that's going into the brain to process into memory. So you have this stimulus going into the organs of sensation and the processing of sensory memory. This is the first biological, neurological piece of memory. This is essentially light falls on the retina, and for a moment, information is gathered within the retina. The retina is holding on to information. That's the memory we're talking about, not the memory storage in the brain. It's actually the nervous system is actually responding. That chemical change, the neuron receptors activating information to pass it on from one neuron to the next. That is the first stage in the memory process. Now we see that represented in the box below. Sensory memory, 3 kinds. We have visual or iconic memory, has a life of only half a second. Information that we see visually is only imprinted on our nervous system in the retina for half a second. Oral information or auditory, echoic information is available for 3 seconds, and tactile up to 10 seconds. So the neurons hold that information for a particular amount of time. This stage of the process of memory is incredibly volatile, meaning it can slip away very easily. It's just imprinted on the nervous system, so an overwhelming interference at that point, if we're looking at something and then we hear a loud noise, that oral information coming in could overwhelm any visual information and quickly move that out of memory as new neurons are being activated into this process. So it's a slippery place for information to be. And we see that if there is something that comes along during that sensory memory process, that interference will cause us to not process that information anymore. However, when let's say we're sitting in a classroom and we are purposefully focusing our attention on something, attention becomes the process by which we concentrate our neurological efforts from our brain on particular stimuli. Attention is a huge aspect of memory. So you have all this information coming in. Some of it's screened out by the nervous system itself. It's very volatile, ready to go, ready to disappear. And we have to concentrate at some level to focus on what it is that we're motivated to pay attention to and further exclude some of that information. Now, attention is such a big part of the memory process that it is the first sort of line of access to information in learning. Therefore, any problems with attention are defined as learning disabilities. So attention deficit is really, at least at a surface level, the inability to focus in the presence of particular other stimuli. It's the inability or a lesser ability to be able to focus on the thing that you're supposed to be focusing on. That doesn't mean that people with attention deficit can't focus. In fact, some of them are extremely good at focusing, but when there's competing elements around, there's other stimuli coming in, actually weeding out, and in a learning situation, weeding out all the stuff that might actually be more entertaining. You know, what's going on with your neighbor over here, the stuff on the wall, or this imagination that's going on. Being able to screen those things out is the deficit that a person with attention deficit experiences. Now, if we're able to pay attention, then the information moves on into working memory, what we might call short-term memory. It is while something is in short-term memory that we exercise our learning strategies, generally referred to as rehearsal. So we process the information in working memory. If we are successful, if we're unsuccessful in doing that, that information is pushed out with interference, or we don't have a successful methodology for learning information. If, however, we are successful and our methodology works, that information moves into long-term memory. Now, long-term memory storage, again, not really quite sure how that works. It's nodal, meaning that we organize information topically and we make connections. Almost like if you drew a circle and then a circle to another circle and then to another circle, and each one of those circles contains information and we connect them. We experience this when actually we say we're engaged in daydreaming and someone comes along and says, what are you thinking about? And you're like, wow, I'm going to have to explain this. I was thinking about this, and it made me think of this, then this, then this, and this, and pretty soon I'm like, how do I prepare pineapple dessert, or something like that. I'm like way off on some other place because of that nodal connections between memory and how we understand that it gets connected in long-term memory. Now, here's a key. When the world asks us, we see something or we're at a test and the world asks us, hey, let's go get that information that you stored into long-term memory. A whole different process there, the process of retrieval. And the notion is, if we have engaged in rehearsal processes that allow us to organize information efficiently, and we've done that well, then it increases the likelihood when presented with cues or demands for us to recall that information that we'll be successful. When we recall something, that information moves from long-term memory back into, I'll get to that in a second, it moves back into working memory. So we actually bring long-term memories back into working memory. And every time we do that, when we take long-term and we move it back into working memory, we again engage that rehearsal process. So as many times as we can take things from long-term memory and put them into short-term memory, it's called practice and review. As many times as we can do that, reinforces the long-term memory. Now, my dot went in a little direction there. If this is the use it or lose it mentality here of we can have information in long-term memory. And sometimes if we don't engage in that process of going into long-term memory and bring it into short-term memory back and forth, then sometimes we can forget. Now, it's still remarkable, however, that we can have a memory from way back and we're just kind of going along life. I haven't thought about my best friend from kindergarten in a real long time. And then there's a sight or a song or something that comes up and I'm like, and that rich memory comes in. Where was that? Where was that located? And just like this ability for the brain to store all of this information. Pretty amazing. Now, let's talk about the actual cognitive processes involved in creating memory. So we've talked a little bit here about the processes of memory, all of this going on. Now the cognition kicks in and we start to engage in two processes that were initially identified by Jean Piaget. And those are assimilation and accommodation. Now what I want you to think about are schemas. From the beginning of life, we began incorporating information about the world, building internal representations of the world that we can refer to as schemas. Now, schema is a concept, an idea, sometimes even just a word. So let's take the word apple, maybe one of the first words that we really learned. And apple means a lot of things. It means different things to different people, and different people can have different levels of expertise about apple. Let's just stick with the fruit and not the computer for a while. So maybe early in life we have a very simplistic understanding of apple. It's that red thing. or green, and we eat it sometimes, and it's the very commonly the object used to refer to the letter A in our first books. So A for apple and whatnot. So that rudimentary schema gets developed as we assimilate information into our memory. As we get older and we begin to experience different kinds of apples, different kinds of apple trees, some apples that are used for eating, others are used for pie, those kinds of things, our existing schema, which is fairly limited, becomes increasingly complex as the result of new information coming in and being added to those memories. That is the process of accommodation. Accommodation, think about it like changing something that's existing. So we have assimilation and accommodation going on throughout our lives, and various schemas that we have of the thousands and thousands of schemas. Some become very rich and we become experts at those things. Some remain relatively undeveloped, and I don't really know a lot about rocket engines and how they work. That schema is pretty underdeveloped compared to any of my NASA colleagues that might work on jet engines every day. However, my schemas within the field of psychology are much more complex, maybe more complex than my NASA colleagues. Now, that process of assimilation and accommodation is motivated, meaning we mean to do it. It's almost instinctual at the beginning, but then we are purposefully, through the processes of, let's go back to the memory thing. We have classical conditioning, building schemas, we have operant conditioning, and then we have cognitive learning, which is really what we're talking about, very effortful things that we do in order to accommodate and assimilate memories into our mind, the process of active learning. So we refer to these processes as constructivist, meaning we construct our memories, we build them. They're not videotapes, they're not direct copies of reality. We take them, we incorporate them into existing memories. They're competed by existing emotions, other aspects of our awareness going on, our consciousness at any given point in which we are learning those processes. So during the process of assimilation and accommodation, as we construct memories, we also build in error. So our memories are not necessarily accurate. And that's a challenge. We build and add pieces to our memory in order to fill in the blanks that we didn't necessarily experience, to make a full picture. Almost everybody I've ever met has experienced the idea, particularly in a emotional situation where two people were at the same place at the same time, and yet they have vastly different memories of what happened. This can happen in an argument where, oh, you said that yesterday, and they're like, I never said that. And it was like, we were both there, and one is convinced it was said, one is convinced that it was not. We might go to an event, and we'll say this and that happened, and someone says, I never saw that happen. And yet, because when we are constructing memories, we are filling in the blanks, and there happens to be an important thing that happened to one person, and we filled it in with, basically, bondo, keeping that memory consistent, then that gap in our memory that they don't have a gap, that becomes sort of a source of discrepancy between those two memories. That's why we see issues such as eyewitness testimony, and when people write about their experience of particular things, why those stories can be so different. Maybe the core reality of what happened is the same. The stories of individuals that were in the Twin Towers at 9/11 are similar in many ways, but vastly different in very important ways as well. So important for us to know that. Now in the course book, moving on to our ability to be motivated to learn something and engage material in a way to assimilate and accommodate information and organize it within our brain for easy retrieval, the whole purpose of education. I posted a video, and that video is the 6 Habits of Highly Successful Students. It's really good to watch that. We'll summarize that video by looking at individually each one of the 6 habits presented in this video. Now, the acronym, the word that describes, there's a word is answer. ANSWER is the acronym that we use to identify these six habits of learning. That the use of an acronym is actually a tool for memorizing things. It's a mnemonic, which is a category of words and strategies that are used to make some things easier to understand and remember than others. So we're going to use a mnemonic to actually talk about strategies in learning. So we're going to use a strategy in learning to talk about strategies in learning. So first, the A stands for ask, explain, and connect. This can be done in a classroom or it can be done on your own. While you're reading material, you can ask yourself questions, research those questions, explain to yourself the answers, and connect those answers to related information and other learning that you already have. You're actually specifically making those nodal connections between. In fact, throughout my college career, I developed the habit of actually drawing circles and putting concepts and connecting them to other circles, sometimes not related to the class. I'm learning about some sort of biological process and I'll connect it to things that I experienced when I was working in a potato field or something like that when I was a kid. So making those connections to existing experiences strengthen the bonds to those particular experiences and increase the level of learning. So making those connections. No cramming. Cramming is not a very efficient way of learning. Better to engage in 2 processes, either or, spaced and high impact learning. Now, spaced learning is when we study a little bit, a lot of different times, as opposed to one big chunk of time. And that little bit, now think about the process where we're going in and we're taking long-term memory, putting into short-term memory. When we study something for a really long time, we're holding that stuff in short-term memory for a long time. It's more important that we transfer it from long-term memory to short-term memory more often. Okay, that we're doing that more often is going to reinforce that information in long-term memory better. So it's better if you have 2 hours you're going to prepare for a particular test, it's better to have 8 15-minute periods or 4 30-minute periods than it is to have one big chunk of 2 hours. You just engage in that process of transferring from long-term memory to working memory more often. Now, high impact practices include a lot of different things. When you draw things out, when you have experiential information, when you tell stories or you write songs or you have, whatever it is, flashcards, these are experiences with the material that are more rich and more involved than the actual test. So if I'm going to have a multiple choice test, but I've written about something, I have drawn pictures about something, I have got the anatomy coloring book, I have, whatever it is I'm trying to learn, I've overlearned that information using all of these sort of fun techniques. The multiple choice quiz is easy. The little essay question is easy. I can pull that off. I know this stuff cold. So those high impact practices, if you can engage in those specifically focused on the material that you're going to be tested on, it's going to be a very good process. Switching is again relating to the idea of moving information from long-term memory to working memory. In this kind of way, many of you probably have lots of things that you're learning, and let's say you have 2 hours every day. Rather than 2 hours on psychology, 2 hours on math, 2 hours on biology, what you want to do is switch topics. Here's the thing. If you let's say you have 2 hours and you have 4 topics, you're going to do a half hour of studying each one, it's going to feel like you're not learning as well as if you did 2 hours straight. It's going to be difficult. You're having difficulty learning that material. You need to be okay with that. If you're having difficulty, that means your brain is working. If you study for 2 hours, at the end of that 2 hours, of course you've been learning it for 2 hours. Of course it's going to be right there, but it is actually not as solid in your brain as if you spaced out that practice. And each day was actually more difficult than doing it for 2 hours. So getting through that difficulty by switching from topic to topic or subject to subject, and then the next day you're going back and doing it again, doing those same 4 subjects. I mean, I'm looking at a particular kind of scenario here, but however you would schedule that, to be able to space out the practice and then switch topics, that keeps you very limber, and it's actually, in the long run, it produces better test results. Converting things to words and visuals. This is a high impact process. Write things out, actually writing or typing, drawing things, creating images, whatever it is, however way you can engage additional sensory material, that much more information going in. Remember all of that red dot that was going into sensory memory. The more times you're pushing things into sensory memory, the more chances are they're going to be reinforced in short-term memory and then into long-term memory after that. Use examples. Critical. In fact, this is a sort of a big part of the way I actually assess learning in my own classes is I think if someone can come up with when you're asking for someone to learn a concept such as daydreaming, I would rather the individual come up with an example of daydreaming and what it meant and what it did than simply telling me what a daydream is and what it means. Way better for someone to be, because that actually connects. That's, we're repeating something here. We're asking, explaining, and connecting. When we connect things to examples in the real world, then great learning can happen. Another way of doing that is through analogy. Now, analogies are creative tools that individuals can use to explain complex ideas such as, cognitive emotions and whatnot. I remember early in my career, I was working with one individual who was going through a hard time in her recovery process from being extremely abused. And she had lots of defense mechanisms, and we were talking. I'm trying to think, how do I get this person to think about defense mechanisms and being in pain, not even though, that she's... Anyway, here was the analogy. She was from Maine, she's from the coast, so I said, well, you're kind of like a lobster. And she's like, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, you're in a shell, and that external shell has protected you all this time. It's got you to this point. You survived all of these situations. However, now that you're talking about them, you're beginning to grow and the shell is starting to hurt you. The actual protective mechanisms that you have created that got you to this point are now causing you pain. So eventually a lobster has to abandon its shell and grow a new shell. So as you grow, sometimes you need to shed some of those defense mechanisms that were there, expose yourself to some vulnerabilities and make sure it's a good time and space in your life to do that, and then grow a new, bigger, comfortable shell. And maybe it's a different kind of shell. Maybe it's a soft shell now, working from a hard shell to a soft. And we just got into this kind of clever conversation about lobsters. And for that person, it was sort of, the straw that did it. She very much enjoyed that. In fact, I had the extreme privilege of running into her a decade later at Barnes & Noble in Augusta, and she said hi to me and came over and how things going, blah, blah, blah. And she relayed that story. It was such a memorable thing. She said, every once in a while I shed my lobster shell. That she still engaged. That analogy was deeply remembered by her. It was a very, very cool experience, being able to give an example or an analogy. recall what you know. Here in the last year, recall this going into long-term memory and bringing it into short-term memory. This is essentially self-testing. When you are learning new information, you want to continually test yourself on that. In addition, you're also continually testing yourself on old information. Think about this sort of like in martial arts. When somebody is testing for their black belt, and I've watched some of these processes myself, they have to demonstrate everything from the most basic technique to whatever techniques it is in that particular discipline to earn that level of achievement. So they have to practice it all. And the stuff that they've been practicing for years becomes really solid. So by the time they become a black belt, they've practiced those things so much, and they continue to practice them because those basics are so important in terms of the success of being a martial artist. So going back to the basics and relearning that information and then focusing on what's new, processes of continually testing yourself, great way to approach learning. Now, so we have answer. There's your answer. Answers. I'd probably put an S on the end of there and come up with another one. There are, however, some lifestyle sort of things that go into habits of learning, and that includes your diet, making sure that drinking here can be interpreted as both as avoiding excessive alcohol, but also making sure that you're hydrated, getting exercise, rest, sleep, engaging in recreation. Each one of these has been highly correlated with achievement in learning. So we have answer, ask, explain, connect. No cramming, looking at spaced practice and high impact activities. Switching between topics. We have words and visuals, and then we have examples. Self-testing, those kinds of processes are all what you need to do, but you need to take care of the body as well. Make sure the machine is operating well, all at that same time. So here we've explored the process of memory and what it means in terms of learning, and this is the third part of what we started in the learning chapter when we talked about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Now we're moving into, motivated learning and the processes that we have, where if we address the answer, all of those, and we have a healthy as we can body to do it in, then learning happens. All right, so that's it for this chapter. Hope you've enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.